Hi Year 5! I'm here to read chapter 13 of Tom's Midnight Garden to you. So, chapter 13 is called The Late Mr. Bartholomew. In the Kitsons' flat, time was not allowed to dodge about in the unreliable, confusing way it did in the garden. Forward to a tree's falling, and then back to before the fall, and then still further back again to a little girl's first arrival, and then forward again. No, in the flat, time was marching steadily onwards in a way it is supposed to go, from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day. The day for Tom's going home had already come and gone, but he was still staying with his aunt and uncle. He had managed that for himself. The very day before he was due to go, he had nerved himself, cleared his throat and said, "I wish I hadn't to go home tomorrow." Uncle Alan had been reading the newspaper. The sheets crumpled down onto his knees, as though his hands no longer had the strength to hold them. His eyes refocused from the print onto Tom. "What?" "I wish I hadn't had to go home tomorrow," said Tom. He dared not farther, but he spoke loudly. Aunt Gwen gave a cry of amazement and delight, and actually clapped her hands. "Would you like to stay?" "Yes." "Several days more? Another week?" "Or more," said Tom. "We'll send a telegram at once," said Aunt Gwen, and ran out. Tom and his uncle were left together. Alan Kitson studied Tom with intent curiosity. "Why do you want to stay here?" "I won't if you'd rather not," said Tom with pride, but his heart sank at the thought. "No, no," Uncle Alan still watched him. "But I wondered why. What is there to interest a boy here, to pass his time even?" "I just like it here," Tom muttered. Aunt Gwen came back from sending her telegram to Tom's parents. Her face was flushed. She spoke fast and eagerly. "We'll go about and see the sights and go on excursions. We'll do so much now you're out of quarantine and staying on. You needn't be cooped up dully indoors any longer, Tom." Tom said, "Thank you," but without enthusiasm. He would have much preferred to be left to dullness indoors, as he used to be. He lived his real and interesting life at night time, when he went into the garden. In the daytime, he wanted only peace, to think back and to think forwards, always to the garden. To write of the garden to Peter. He did not want to sleep, but, all the same, the daytime in the flat was like a period of sleep to him. He needed its rest. Aunt Gwen arranged several expeditions to the shops and to the museum in Castleford and the cinema. Tom bore them patiently. He liked the cinema best because it was in the dark, and so he could sit with his eyes shut and think his own thoughts. Towards the end of Tom's lengthened stay, the weather changed for the worse. Still, Aunt Gwen obstinately insisted on treats and trips, now with waterproofs and umbrella. After a visit to the cinema, she and Tom had been obliged to wait for some time for the bus, and Tom had stood in a puddle. It was his aunt who noticed his position, that only as the bus came. "Tom, you've been standing in a puddle all this time. Quite a deep puddle." He was surprised. His head had been in the clouds, in the white clouds that pile above an eternally summer garden, and he had not been noticing his feet at all. Now that he thought of them, they certainly felt very damp and cold. "I hope you don't catch a cold," his aunt said anxiously. In answer to this, Tom sneezed. His aunt rushed him home to a hot drink and a hot bath and bed. But a cold, once it has its fingers on its victim, will seldom loosen its grip before the due time. So Tom had a severe cold that kept him in bed for several days and indoors for many more. His convalescence was not hurried. Gwen Kitson wrote happily to her sister that Tom would not be fit to travel for some time yet, and Tom wrote to Peter, "It's a wonderful piece of luck, the next best thing to measles." Every night he was able to steal downstairs as usual into the garden, and there the feverishness of his chill always left him, as though the very greenness of trees and plants and grass cooled his blood. He played with Hattie. In the daytime he lay back among his pillows, deliberately. Uncle Alan, who was touched by the idea of a sick child, offered to teach him chess, but Tom said that he did not feel clear-headed enough. He did not want to talk, and he allowed his aunt to see that he was certainly not up to being read to from schoolgirl adventures. At the beginning of Tom's illness, his head had really felt a little light, and his eyelids gummed themselves up easily. He did not mind keeping them closed. Then, in his imagination, he could look into his garden and see in fancy what Hattie might be doing there. His aunt would tiptoe into the bedroom and look at him doubtfully. She would test whether he were awake by a whispering of his name. The voice recalled him. Without his understanding at once to what, his eyelids opened onto his own bedroom, but his eyes printed off the shadowy figure of Hattie against the barred window and the cupboard, and between himself and the figure of his aunt at the foot of the bed. Hattie's image haunted the room for Tom at this time, and so it was perhaps that he began, at first idly, then seriously, to consider whether she herself were not, in some unusual way, a ghost. There was no one who knew her ghost story and could tell it to Tom, so he began trying to make it up for himself. Hattie had lived here long, long ago, in this very house with the garden he knew of. Here she had lived, here died. From below sounded the striking of Mrs. Bartholomew's grandfather clock, that knew secrets but would not tell them. Listening, Tom suddenly caught his breath. Mrs. Bartholomew, of course! She of all people might know something of the past history of this house. Or rather, there must once have been a Mr. Bartholomew, and his family had perhaps owned this house for generations, and therefore he had known all about it. He would surely have told his wife the history of it, which she would still remember. Tom resolved that, as soon as he was better, he would call on Mrs. Bartholomew. True, she was an unsociable old woman, of whom people were afraid, but Tom could not let that stand in his way. He would boldly ring her front doorbell. She would open her front door just a crack and peer crossly at him. Then she would see him at the sight of his face, and her heart would melt. Tom had read of such occurrences in more old-fashioned children's books. He had never before thought them very probable, but now it suited him to believe. Mrs. Bartholomew, who did not like children, would love Tom as soon as she saw his face. She would draw him inside at once, then and there, and later, over a tea table laden with delicacies for him alone, she would tell Tom the stories of long ago. Sometimes Tom would ask questions, and she would answer them. "A little girl called Harriet, or Hattie?" she would say musingly. "Why, yes, my late husband told me once of such a child. Oh, long ago, an only child she was, and an orphan. When her parents died, her aunt took her into his house to live. Her aunt was a disagreeable woman." So the story in Tom's imagination rolled on. It became confused and halting where Tom himself did not already know the facts. But, after all, he would only have to wait to pay his call upon Mrs. Bartholomew, to hear it all from her own lips. She would perhaps end her story, he thought, with a dropping of her voice. And since then, Tom, they say, that she and her garden and all the rest of the haunt this house. They say that those who are lucky may go down, about when the clock strike for midnight, and open that what once was the garden door, and see the ghost of that garden and of the little girl. Tom's mind ran on the subject. His cold was getting so much better now that his aunt and uncle had insisted on coming to sit with him, to keep him company. One day, hardly speaking aloud, Tom began a sentence. "When Mr. Bartholomew lived in this house—" "But I don't think Mr. Bartholomew ever did live here," said Aunt Gwen. "Do you, Alan?" Uncle Alan did not answer at first, being in the depths of a chess problem in which he had failed to interest Tom. "But Aunt Gwen," Tom protested, "this was his family home. How else would he have known the history of this house and the ghost stories? How else could he have told Mrs. Bartholomew?" "Why, Tom," said his aunt in bewilderment, "Mr. Bartholomew, whoever he was, never lived in this house." Uncle Alan now said positively, "Mrs. Bartholomew was a widow when she came here, and that wasn't so many years ago either." "But what about the clock?" What clock? The grandfather clock in the hall. You said it belonged to Mrs. Bartholomew. But that clock has always been in this house. It was here long, long ago. It was here when the house had a garden. Now, what a reason have you for supposing all this, Tom? Asked Uncle Alan. He spoke less sharply than usual because he really thought the boy must be feverish. Tom was searching in his mind for an explanation that yet would not give away his secret, when his aunt came unexpectedly to his rescue. You know, Alan, the clock certainly must have been here a long time because of its screws at the back having rusted into the wall. Well, now, Tom, that might explain a little, said Uncle Alan. He patted Tom's hand as it lay on the counterpane to soothe him. The clock may well have been here a long time ago, as you say, and during that time the screws rusted up. After that happened, the clock couldn't be moved without danger of damaging it. When old Mrs. Bartholomew came, she had to buy the clock with the house. You see, Tom, it's all quite straightforward if you reason it out. From that time, abruptly, Tom ceased to hope for anything from Mrs. Bartholomew. The possibility of Hattie's being a ghost stayed in his mind. However, at the back of his mind, he was not even aware of the presence of the idea, until one day in the garden it became the cause of a quarrel with Hattie herself. It was the only real quarrel that ever took place between them. They were beginning to build their tree house in the steps of St. Paul's, as usual. Tom was directing, while Hattie did the work of pulling and plaiting branches together to make the walls. The floor, of old pieces of boarding that Hattie had found in the potting shed, was already in place. Hattie, as she worked, was singing to herself from hymn songs and ballads. Now she was singing the end of the ballad, Sweet Molly Malone. Her ghost wheels her barrow through streets broad and narrow, singing cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh! And Hattie continued to murmur under her breath the refrain, alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh. Suddenly, Tom said, he blurted it out before he could help himself. What's it like? I wonder what it's like to be dead and a ghost. Hattie stopped singing at once and looked at him slyly over her shoulder and laughed. Tom repeated the question. What is it like to be a ghost? Like? Said Hattie. She turned fully to face him and laid a hand upon his knee and looked eagerly into his face. Ah, tell me, Tom. For a moment, Tom did not understand her. Then he jumped to his feet and shouted, I'm not a ghost! Don't be silly, Tom, Hattie said. You forget that I saw you go right through the orchard door when it was shut. That proves what I say, said Tom. I'm not a ghost, but the orchard door is, and that was why I could go through it. The door's a ghost, and the garden's a ghost, and so are you too. Indeed I'm not. You are. They were glaring at each other now. Hattie was trembling. You're a silly little boy, she said, and Tom thought resentfully that she seemed to have been growing up a good deal too much recently. And you make a silly little ghost. Why do you think you wear those clothes of yours? None of my cousins ever played in the garden in clothes like that. Such outdoor clothes can't belong to nowadays. I know, such clothes. They're my pyjamas, said Tom indignantly. My best visiting pyjamas. I sleep in them, and this is my bedroom slipper. His second slipper had been left, as usual, to wedge the flat door upstairs. And you go about so in the daytime, always in your night clothes? Hattie said scornfully. And it's the fashion nowadays, is it, to wear only one slipper? Really, you are silly to give such excuses. You wear strange clothes that no one wears nowadays because you're a ghost. Why am I the only person in the garden who sees you? I can see a ghost. Hattie would never believe the real explanation of his clothes, and Tom chose what he thought was a shorter counter-argument. Do you know I could put my hand through you, now, just as if it weren't there? Hattie laughed. I could, shouted Tom. She pointed at him. You're a ghost! In a passion, Tom hit her a blow upon the outstretched wrist. There was great force of will as well as a muscle behind the blow, and his hand went right through. Not quite as through thin air, for Tom felt something. And Hattie snatched back her wrist and nursed it in her other hand. She looked as if she might cry, but that could not have been for any pain, for the sensation had not been strong enough. In a wild defence of herself, Hattie still goaded him. Your hand didn't go through my wrist went through your hand. You're a ghost with a cruel, ghostly hand. Do you hear me? Tom shouted. You're a ghost, and I've proved it. You're dead and gone, and a ghost. There was a quietness then, in which could be heard a cuckoo's stuttering cry from the wood beyond the garden, and then the sound of Hattie's beginning softly to weep. I'm not dead. Oh, please, Tom, I'm not dead. Now that the shouting had stopped, Tom was not sure of the truth, after all, but only sure that Hattie was crying as he had never seen her cry since she had been a very little girl, wearing mourning black and weeping her way along the sundial path, weeping for death so early. He put his arm around her. All right then, Hattie, you're not a ghost. I take it all back, all of it. Only don't cry. He calmed her, and she consented at last to dry her tears and go back to plaiting the branches, only sniffing occasionally. Tom did not reopen the subject that upset her so deeply, although he felt that he owed it to himself to say some time later, Mind you, I'm not a ghost either. This, by her silence, Hattie seemed to allow. I hope you enjoyed the next chapter of Tom's Midnight Garden. It should be Mrs. Hardy, I think, next week, reading the next chapter to you. So I'll see you soon. Bye.